Dawn breaks over the gray waters of the North Atlantic. The horizon glows faintly, yet the air already vibrates with menace. From the cockpits of the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s, German pilots look down with disdain at the stubby, almost clumsy silhouettes of the American F4F Wildcats below. Their laughter crackles over the radio, arrogant and sharp, as though destiny itself had guaranteed their superiority. To them, these wildcats seemed less like predators and more like barnyard cats, slow, underfed, and waiting to be culled. But war has a way of punishing arrogance. The first bursts of machine gun fire do not sound like victory songs. They roar like thunder. The Germans, expecting an easy kill, suddenly face streams of .50 caliber fire that tears through wings and engines with brutal precision. The air smells of cordite and burning fuel, and in the cockpit, even the bravest pilot feels his throat tighten as black smoke curls past his canopy. What was mocked only seconds earlier now becomes a predator with claws of steel. Imagine yourself inside one of those cockpits. The stick shakes violently under your grip, the Wildcat resisting every roll and climb as though reminding you it was built not for grace but survival. Your goggles fog with sweat, your ears ring with the thunder of guns, and beneath you the Atlantic stretches like an endless grave. And still, the Wildcat keeps flying, battered, scarred, but alive, while the vaunted Messerschmitt spirals into the sea. History is full of machines that were underestimated. Tanks called coffins, rifles called primitive, aircraft dismissed as obsolete. Yet the Wildcat carried a lesson etched in tracer rounds: never mistake ruggedness for weakness. Its designers built it not for elegance but endurance. Its pilots, mocked at first, soon learned to wield its stubborn strength like a shield, and its firepower like a hammer. This is not just the tale of a machine. It is a story of perception, arrogance, and survival. It is about how the underdog of the skies clawed its way into legend, forcing even its most cynical enemies to admit respect. And in this episode, we will dive deep: the tactical doctrines, the engineering secrets, the memoirs of men who flew and fought inside this metal cage. You will see the Wildcat not as it was mocked, but as it truly was, a relentless survivor of the skies. So fasten your belts, adjust your headset, and join us on this cinematic journey. If you want more stories where history breathes, where steel machines speak louder than myths, and where forgotten battles return to life, subscribe now and keep flying with us. The Wildcat's claws are just beginning to show. The year is 1940, and Europe is burning. The Luftwaffe dominates the skies, its Messerschmitts and Junkers carving across the continent like blades through paper. In Germany, confidence hardens into arrogance. In Britain, survival balances on the edge of exhaustion. Across the Atlantic, America has not yet entered the war, but in the naval shipyards of Grumman, engineers hammer together a machine that would soon be dismissed as crude, outdated, and laughably inadequate: the F4F Wildcat. German pilots, groomed in the tradition of the clean kill and heirs to the myth of the knightly fighter ace, saw the Wildcat as little more than a training target. In memoirs and Luftwaffe debriefings, descriptions of the aircraft were laced with scorn: too slow, too heavy, unrefined. They measured speed and agility as the currencies of aerial supremacy, and by those metrics, the Wildcat seemed bankrupt. To fly against such a machine was, to many, an insult rather than a challenge. Yet history is rarely decided by first impressions. While German engineers polished sleek frames for performance, American designers faced a different question. How do you build an aircraft that can operate from cramped carrier decks, survive battle damage, and return its pilot home? The Wildcat's squat frame, thick armor plating, and folding wings were answers to these brutal demands. But these answers came at a price: sluggish acceleration, a slow climb rate, and controls that required muscle to manage in combat. To the Luftwaffe, this was evidence of backwardness. To the men who would later fly it, it was proof of endurance. In the early years of the war, ridicule shaped more than just propaganda. It crept into strategy. Reports from German officers often dismissed engagements with Wildcats as uneventful, convincing many that American naval aviation posed no real threat. This underestimation echoed across briefing rooms, creating a dangerous gap between perception and reality. When those perceptions collided with combat, The results were catastrophic. Consider the environment in which the Wildcat fought. The Pacific theater's endless seas and unforgiving weather demanded not just speed but resilience. Fuel lines froze, engines coughed saltwater into their pistons, and pilots endured hours of monotonous patrol before sudden bursts of violence. A fragile machine would not last. The Wildcat did. Naval officers noted that pilots returned from missions in aircraft punctured with holes the size of fists, wings shredded, oil leaking across the fuselage, yet the plane still managed to land. Its toughness became a whispered legend on carrier decks, a promise to young aviators that even if everything else failed, their machine would not abandon them. And still, the mockery continued. German intelligence often painted the Wildcat as a stopgap measure, a relic soon to be replaced by more advanced designs. But by the time those reports were circulated, American pilots had already begun shaping tactics around its quirks. Never turn with a zero, never chase a Messerschmitt uphill, fight the fight your aircraft allows, read one manual circulated among Navy squadrons. The Wildcat was not a duelist, it was a brawler. Its role was not to dazzle but to survive, and survival meant holding the line until reinforcements, carriers, or flak guns could finish the job. The problem, then, was not just technological. It was psychological. German pilots carried with them a cultural script that equated elegance with superiority. They sneered at machines that lacked finesse, failing to recognize that war rewards not beauty but utility. This blind spot would cost them dearly, for it blinded them to the very strengths that made the Wildcat dangerous. Its resilience, its firepower, and its ability to absorb punishment while still clawing back. Testimonies from American pilots further illuminate the divide. One recalled, "The Germans laughed at us in the beginning. They thought we flew crates. But crates with teeth can still kill." Another noted how enemy pilots seemed shocked when Wildcats, trailing smoke and oil, refused to go down. "I could see their hesitation," he wrote in his diary, "as if they were asking themselves, 'Why won't this thing die?'" That hesitation, brief, but real, shifted the tempo of battle, creating openings that American squadrons learned to exploit. By late 1941 and into 1942, the narrative began to fracture. German arrogance met stubborn American steel, and the results filtered back in broken wings and lost pilots. The Wildcat had become something more than the sum of its parts. It was a statement: underestimation is as lethal as enemy fire. Thus the central issue emerges. The F4F Wildcat was mocked because it failed to meet the Luftwaffe's aesthetic of aerial supremacy. Yet it triumphed precisely because war is not an air show, it is attrition, survival, adaptation. The question that haunted pilots on both sides was not which plane looked superior, but which one kept flying when the sky turned hostile. And in that question lay the undoing of German confidence. The central problem is deceptively simple. The German Luftwaffe dismissed the F4F Wildcat as an obsolete machine, yet in combat it proved maddeningly resilient, altering tactical doctrines and reshaping the psychology of aerial warfare. Understanding why requires stripping away the mockery and examining the Wildcat not through the lens of elegance but through engineering choices, battlefield conditions, and human adaptation. At first glance, the F4F looked unimpressive. Its fuselage was stout, its wings lacked the sweeping grace of a Messerschmitt, and its performance figures seemed dated even before it entered service. But each of these flaws concealed deliberate design decisions shaped by the brutal realities of carrier warfare. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which operated from vast, secure airfields, the U.S. Navy needed a fighter that could launch from short decks, survive harsh seas, and fight far from logistical support. The Wildcat was never intended to outdance its opponents. It was engineered to endure them. Consider the landing gear, a system often derided by German observers. The Wildcat employed a manually cranked mechanism requiring 30 turns of a handwheel to retract the wheels. Slow, archaic, and physically exhausting in combat, this feature drew ridicule. Yet it also provided simplicity. Fewer hydraulic lines to rupture when hit, fewer complex systems to fail under the strain of carrier operations. An analyst examining combat reports noted that Wildcats often returned with half their fuselage shredded, but their gears still extended, allowing the pilot to land safely on the deck. The airframe told a similar story. While Messerschmitts favored speed through light construction, Grumman built the Wildcat like a flying vault. Armor plating shielded the pilot's cockpit, and self-sealing fuel tanks absorbed bullets that would have turned other planes into fireballs. Pilots described returning to base with fuel leaking across their boots, only to discover that the tanks had swollen shut, preventing a catastrophic explosion. To Luftwaffe eyes, this was wasted weight. To U.S. Navy strategists, it was the difference between losing an aircraft and losing a trained pilot, a distinction that mattered when replacements were weeks away across the Pacific. Weaponry formed another layer of the Wildcat's paradox. Its 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns lacked the glamour of cannon-equipped German aircraft, yet they offered relentless reliability. Ammunition belts fed smoothly even after hours of patrol, and the heavy rounds punched through armor with brutal effect. In one documented engagement, a Wildcat scored hits on a Bf-110 twin-engine fighter, shredding its control surfaces within seconds. German crews, accustomed to duels of maneuver, were often shocked at the sheer destructive force of those .50 caliber bursts. Performance, of course, was where the Wildcat seemed most vulnerable. With a top speed of around 318 miles per hour, it lagged behind the Messerschmitt Bf-109's 350-plus mph capability. Its climb rate was sluggish, its roll less agile. But this is where the Wildcat story transcends statistics. Numbers suggest weakness, tactics reveal strength. American pilots quickly learned to exploit dive speeds, using the aircraft's sturdy frame to withstand maneuvers that would have torn lighter fighters apart. They fought with vertical energy, trading altitude for bursts of speed, then clawing back into position. Manuals from carrier squadrons emphasized patience. You are not faster, you are not prettier, but you can take punishment they cannot. Even its folding wings, mocked as an ungainly contraption, proved decisive. On cramped carrier decks, the mechanism allowed twice as many aircraft to be stored, effectively doubling the firepower that could be projected across oceans. To the Luftwaffe, operating from European bases, this seemed irrelevant. To the Pacific Fleet, it was a strategic multiplier. One of the most underestimated aspects of the Wildcat's design was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp radial. Unlike inline engines of German aircraft, which were vulnerable to a single bullet through coolant lines, the radial layout provided redundancy. Even with cylinders knocked out, the engine often kept running long enough to bring the pilot home. Reports from Guadalcanal and Midway described Wildcats limping back with smoke trailing, engines coughing, yet still delivering their pilots onto carrier decks. This capacity for survival turned what looked like a liability into an asset. The Wildcat's design philosophy thus embodied a contradiction. Everything that made it appear outdated, manual gear, heavy frame, slower performance, was exactly what made it lethal in the right context. German pilots, blinded by their cultural emphasis on speed and agility, never fully grasped this until they encountered it firsthand. Their laughter at the flying barrel evaporated when those barrels clawed their way back from impossible odds, bristling with firepower. Yet technology alone cannot explain its survival. The Wildcat demanded adaptation from its pilots. Instructors drilled into aviators the principle of energy fighting. Do not linger in a turning duel, do not chase what you cannot catch, use gravity as your ally. Pilots who ignored this often died quickly. Those who embraced it wrote in their logbooks tales of improbable victories. A lumbering Wildcat diving out of the sun, unleashing a burst of fire, then clawing upward before the stunned Messerschmitt could react. This duality, mockery on paper, menace in practice, defines the technical enigma of the F4F Wildcat. To dismiss it was easy. To fight it was costly. Numbers alone never tell the story of a warplane. They are sterile on the page, cold in the briefing room. But when those numbers are translated into lived experience, into sweat on a pilot's brow and the rattle of a cockpit under fire, they reveal truths that charts cannot capture. The Wildcat's reputation, mocked at first, begins to look very different when we set its so-called weaknesses against the realities of combat. Take speed. On paper, the German Messerschmitt Bf-109E could sprint at over 350 miles per hour, sometimes touching 370 in a dive. The Wildcat, by contrast, wheezed along at roughly 318 miles per hour in level flight. A German ace looking at those numbers could laugh with confidence. How could this stubby little barrel ever hope to compete? And indeed, in a drag race across a sunny meadow, the 109 would leave the Wildcat behind. But air combat is not a drag race. It is a chaotic storm of vertical dives, sudden climbs, desperate rolls, and fleeting moments where a single trigger squeeze decides life or death. In that storm, pure top speed often matters less than how an aircraft handles punishment. Now consider survivability. The Bf-109 speed came at a cost: fragility. Its Daimler-Benz inline engine was cooled by liquid circulating through delicate lines. One bullet through those pipes, and the coolant bled away in a matter of minutes. The pilot faced a stark choice: turn for home or risk the engine seizing mid-fight. Many Luftwaffe veterans described the creeping dread of watching their coolant temperature climb, forcing them to break off even when victory seemed within reach. By contrast, the Wildcat's Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engine played by different rules. Air-cooled, redundant, and nearly indestructible, it could shrug off damage that would cripple an inline. Reports from the Pacific describe Wildcats limping back to carriers with one or two cylinders blown apart, yet still delivering their pilots safely. One mechanic remarked, half in awe, half in disbelief, "The damn thing runs even when it shouldn't." Armor protection painted the same paradox. German and Japanese designs prioritized agility, shaving off armor to keep weight low. The Wildcat went the opposite route. Its cockpit was a small fortress of steel plate, its fuel tanks self-sealing to resist fire. To Luftwaffe tacticians, this seemed primitive, even foolish. Why carry dead weight that slowed the machine? But to American naval strategists, who measured value not in aircraft but in trained aviators, the answer was obvious. A slower plane with a living pilot is worth infinitely more than a faster plane whose ace never returns. Pilots told stories of landing with holes punched clean through their fuselages, oil dripping across their boots, and yet climbing out alive. "She may not be pretty," one Navy flyer wrote, "but she'll take a beating and still bring you home." Then there was firepower. The Wildcat carried 4, sometimes 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. These were not elegant weapons. They were blunt instruments of destruction. Each round was nearly half an inch across, heavy enough to shred aluminum skin and crack engine blocks. German fighters boasted a mix of rifle-caliber MG-17s and 20mm cannons. On paper, that looked formidable. But in practice, the Brownings had a savage advantage: reliability. They almost never jammed, even after hours of salt-choked patrols. Pilots trusted that when they pulled the trigger, a storm of lead would answer. A burst of .50 caliber slugs could chew through a Bf-110 twin-engine fighter in seconds, reducing what looked like a juggernaut into falling wreckage. Maneuverability was perhaps the most misunderstood comparison. The Wildcat could not dance with a 0 or a 109 in a flat turn. Its controls were heavy, its climb lethargic, its roll rate sluggish. German pilots, accustomed to dueling in graceful spirals, mocked it as clumsy prey. But American tacticians quickly adapted, developing energy fighting doctrines. They taught their pilots never to play the enemy's game. Don't turn with a 0. Don't chase a 109 uphill. Instead, dive from above, unleash a burst, and climb back into the clouds before the enemy can react. The Wildcat's rugged frame allowed dives at speeds that would tear lighter aircraft apart, turning gravity itself into a weapon. It was not a duelist, it was a brawler. Even the folding wings, another object of ridicule, concealed hidden strength. To Germans operating from wide European airfields, the mechanism seemed laughable: extra weight, extra complexity, with no performance benefit. But on a U.S. carrier, where deck space was measured in feet, those wings meant twice as many aircraft could be packed into the hangars. Twice as many Wildcats meant twice the firepower available when convoys needed protection. What looked like an ungainly gimmick in a Luftwaffe report was, in naval reality, a strategic multiplier. The contrast with the Japanese 0 makes the Wildcat's paradox even clearer. The 0 could reach 331 miles per hour, turn inside almost anything in the sky, and glide for hours on its long range. But it was fragile, without armor or self-sealing tanks. Pilots described the dreadful ease with which a 0 burst into flames after a few .50 caliber hits. To counter its agility, Wildcats invented the thatch weave, two planes crossing paths, each covering the other's tail. What looked like sluggish weaving became a deadly net of overlapping fire. Enemies expecting an easy kill suddenly found themselves trapped in a crossfire. The same principle worked against Germans. The Wildcats' supposed weakness turned into tactical strength when paired with discipline and teamwork. So when you strip away the sneers, the comparison reads differently. Yes, the Messerschmitt was faster, more agile, armed with cannons. Yes, the Zero could pirouette in the sky like a ballerina. But the Wildcat could be shot full of holes and still fly. It could dive harder, absorb punishment, and return with its pilot alive. In war, where pilots were harder to replace than machines, that resilience mattered more than elegance. The Luftwaffe's contempt, repeated in intelligence memos and cockpit chatter, blinded them to this truth. They saw only what their culture valued: speed, grace, agility. They failed to grasp that war rewards endurance, not beauty. And so, again and again, German pilots who mocked the flying barrel found themselves staring down streams of tracers, realizing too late that the barrel had claws. The first time the F4F Wildcat truly bared its claws was not in a quiet skirmish but in the crucible of the Battle of the Atlantic. In early 1941, before America had even formally entered the war, Wildcats from escort carriers guarded convoys braving U-boat-infested waters. German reconnaissance aircraft, Heinkel He-111s and Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors, approached these convoys with confidence. To Luftwaffe crews, spotting Wildcats on the horizon provoked little more than laughter. Flying barrels, they called them in debriefings, convinced that these stubby fighters would pose no real threat. Yet combat told a different story. Reports from convoy escorts note a striking pattern: Wildcats diving headlong into bomber formations, their .50 caliber guns tearing through thin skins of German aircraft. One after-action summary described a Wildcat riddled with bullet holes, its canopy shattered, yet still returning to its carrier after destroying a Condor. The statistics began to shift. In early Atlantic patrols, Wildcats claimed dozens of German long-range aircraft, disrupting U-boat coordination. Each downed reconnaissance plane meant submarines hunting blind in the vast ocean. What had been mocked as slow and outdated now became the scourge of German convoy raiders. But the true crucible came in the Pacific. At the Battle of Wake Island in December 1941, only a handful of Wildcats faced waves of Japanese bombers and fighters. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating from a strip of coral barely long enough for takeoffs. To German observers, hearing reports from their Japanese allies, this was confirmation of their view: the Wildcat would collapse quickly. Yet the defenders of Wake shocked them. In the opening days, Wildcats shot down multiple Japanese bombers, inflicting enough losses to shake Tokyo's confidence. One pilot, Captain Henry Elrod, destroyed 2 bombers in a single sortie, using every ounce of the Wildcat's rugged firepower. His diary captured the grim humor of the moment. They said this machine was a coffin. Funny how it's their boys falling in flames. It was in the Battle of Midway, however, that the Wildcat transformed from underestimated oddity into a legend. On June 4, 1942, as Japanese carriers launched strike after strike, Wildcats scrambled from American decks to intercept. They were slow to climb, struggling to gain altitude before Zeros pounced. Yet once the fight began, the tide shifted. Reports detail how Wildcat squadrons absorbed the initial shock, their armored cockpits shielding pilots from cannon fire long enough to retaliate. Gun camera footage later analyzed by the Navy revealed streams of .50 caliber rounds slicing into Zeros, which burst into flames almost instantly. The kill ratio told its own story. At Midway, Wildcats and other U.S. fighters lost heavily, but Japanese losses were catastrophic. For every Wildcat destroyed, multiple enemy aircraft fell. The key was not elegance but attrition. The Wildcats survived long enough for American dive bombers to strike the Japanese fleet. Pilots recorded the disbelief on their opponents' faces, moments where a Zero, having riddled a Wildcat with cannon fire, pulled away expecting the kill, only to see the barrel-shaped fighter stubbornly still flying. German intelligence officers monitoring Japanese reports began to notice the shift. Where once dispatches mocked the Wildcat as an obsolete brawler, new memos warned of its disturbing resilience. A Luftwaffe officer reportedly noted, "They do not die when they should. The machine absorbs punishment beyond reason. This unnerves our allies, and it would unnerve us." What had been laughter was turning into unease. The statistics reinforced that unease. By late 1942, Wildcats operating in the Solomon Islands achieved kill ratios of roughly 5-2 against Japanese aircraft. In naval terms, this was decisive. American carriers could trade aircraft and still come out ahead. Each destroyed enemy fighter meant not just a plane but an irreplaceable veteran pilot lost. The Wildcat, though slower and clumsier, became a grinder, chewing through Axis airpower relentlessly. Even German pilots flying in Europe began to feel echoes of this shift. Though they seldom faced Wildcats directly, intelligence briefings circulated cautionary tales. American fighters once dismissed as crude had bloodied the air arms of Japan. The implication was clear: underestimating these machines in Europe could be fatal. What had been a joke in 1940 was, by 1942, a warning whispered in briefing rooms. The transformation was undeniable. From mocked barrel to feared survivor, the Wildcat's reputation evolved on a battlefield, written not in propaganda but in wreckage. German bombers plunging into the sea, Japanese Zeros erupting in fire, pilots walking away from cockpits that by all logic should have been their coffins. And with each battle, the laughter faded, replaced by a grudging respect tinged with fear. After Midway, the Wildcat story could have ended as a footnote, a battered survivor holding the line until newer aircraft arrived. But instead, it stepped into its fiercest proving ground, the jungles and seas around Guadalcanal. Here, from August 1942 to early 1943, the Wildcat faced relentless pressure. Japanese naval aviation committed its best Zero pilots to the Solomon Islands, and the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps threw Wildcats into the storm with no guarantee of relief. The conditions were merciless. Henderson Field, the primitive airstrip on Guadalcanal, was nothing more than a scar of coral hacked from the jungle. Wildcats landed amid shell craters, their landing gear straining against uneven surfaces. Fuel supplies were so scarce that pilots sometimes flew with tanks barely half-filled. Every sortie meant gambling not only with the enemy but with mechanical endurance. Yet day after day, Wildcats clawed into the sky. Here the lessons of Midway hardened into doctrine. American pilots perfected the art of team fighting. The thatch weave became not a novelty but a daily routine, executed under the pressure of massed Japanese raids. When Zeros tried to turn inside one Wildcat, its wingman crossed behind, guns spitting a net of fire. Pilots described the satisfaction of watching enemy aces, men who had scorned them, fall into the trap, their aircraft bursting into flames. One Marine aviator, Lieutenant James Sweat, recalled in his log, "They came in grinning, rolling for the easy kill. They left in smoke, if they left at all." The statistics from Guadalcanal shocked analysts on both sides. In the first 3 months, Wildcats destroyed more than 250 Japanese aircraft, often at kill ratios exceeding 2-1 despite being outnumbered. Reports noted Wildcats staggering back to base with holes in their wings large enough for mechanics to crawl through, yet still flyable. In contrast, Japanese records mourned the loss of irreplaceable veterans. The Zero's light frame, once an advantage, now became its Achilles heel. Against the Wildcat's heavy slugs, it could not endure. For the Germans, monitoring through intelligence sharing with Tokyo, these numbers were deeply unsettling. Luftwaffe bulletins initially described the Wildcat as transitional, soon to be replaced. By late 1942, that language had changed. A captured German officer, interrogated in North Africa, admitted that reports from Japan had forced revisions. "We had thought it an obsolete machine. It is no longer spoken of as obsolete, but as persistent, difficult. It is feared because it survives when others fail." At sea, the Wildcat's transformation was equally striking. During the carrier battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, Wildcats rose from decks bristling with tension. Their task was brutal: throw themselves against incoming waves of Japanese bombers, no matter the odds. Gun camera footage and after-action reports show the same pattern. Wildcats diving head-on into tight bomber formations, trading their own survival for disruption. Even when they failed to down attackers, their armored frames absorbed fire long enough to scatter enemy aim. One squadron report from Santa Cruz noted that Wildcats intercepted bombers at 30 miles out, destroying 11 in minutes but losing half their own number. The exchange saved the carrier Enterprise from mortal damage. By now, German pilots had begun to view the Wildcat less as a joke and more as an omen. Luftwaffe newsletters circulated to squadrons included fragments of translated Japanese reports. Among them was a chilling observation: they fly machines that should be dead, but they do not die. For aces accustomed to precision duels and quick victories, this idea was profoundly unsettling. It suggested that future confrontations with American aircraft would not be contests of grace but wars of attrition, and attrition favored the side with greater resources and tougher machines. Guadalcanal cemented the Wildcat's legacy. It was not the fastest bird in the sky, nor the most beautiful, but it proved decisive where it mattered. Pilots began to speak of it with reverence rather than frustration. Diaries record the moment of transformation. The flying barrel had become the shield of the fleet, the workhorse that held the line until reinforcements arrived. And among the enemy, what had begun as laughter now curdled into apprehension. To face a Wildcat meant not just risking defeat, but confronting an opponent who simply refused to yield. By early 1943, the statistics spoke more loudly than propaganda. Wildcats had destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft across the Solomons, often at favorable ratios. More importantly, they had preserved American carriers and bases long enough for reinforcements, new ships, new aircraft, to tip the balance. The Luftwaffe, studying these figures, began to adjust its assessments. Where once analysts scoffed at Grumman's stubby fighter, they now acknowledged it as a formidable tool of attrition. What unnerved them most was not its elegance but its stubbornness. In their words, the American machine endures where ours are delicate. Thus, in the mud of Guadalcanal and the fury of carrier decks, the Wildcat completed its metamorphosis. From mockery to menace, from the butt of jokes to the edge of fear, it carved its place not through brilliance but through refusal to break. And in doing so, it foreshadowed a grim truth: the Luftwaffe's philosophy of swift dominance would falter against a nation that built machines to last. By 1943, the F4F Wildcat had become more than just a fighter of the Pacific. It was now a constant shadow over the gray waters of the Atlantic, perched on the decks of small escort carriers that shepherded convoys through the deadly gauntlet of U-boats and Luftwaffe patrols. For German pilots, accustomed to seeing convoys as easy prey, the appearance of Wildcats was an unpleasant surprise. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor had once been nicknamed the Scourge of the Atlantic, gliding low and slow over convoys, directing submarines onto their victims. But Condors were lumbering giants, vulnerable to any fighter that could reach them. When Wildcats began launching from carriers like USS Bogue and USS Card, the hunters suddenly became hunted. Reports from early 1943 describe Condors intercepted and shredded by .50 caliber fire, breaking apart over the ocean. In one engagement, Wildcats downed 3 Condors in a single day, forcing the Luftwaffe to reconsider its long-range patrol strategy. German bomber crews flying Ju-88s and He-111s soon encountered the same brutal truth. They had expected that Wildcats, slower and clumsier than newer American fighters, would be easy kills. But the Atlantic revealed a different kind of battlefield. Wildcats, often guided by radar vectors from escort carriers, pounced from cloud cover with ferocity. Their heavy guns ripped through bomber formations, scattering survivors. The Luftwaffe began to record rising losses. Between 1942 and mid-1943, dozens of German bombers fell to Wildcats, with convoys reporting kill ratios as high as 4-1. The psychological toll was unmistakable. German pilots, who once scoffed at the Wildcat as a flying barrel, now dreaded the sight of its stubby frame climbing into the sky. One Heinkel pilot, captured after ditching in the Atlantic, confessed under interrogation, "We laughed at it before. But it is hard to laugh when your friends do not come back. The guns are merciless. The machine does not fall even when hit." Such admissions were gold to Allied intelligence, proof that the Wildcat's reputation was no longer a joke but a weapon in itself. Numbers reinforced this shift. By the end of 1943, escort carriers equipped with Wildcats claimed more than 150 German aircraft destroyed over the Atlantic. Losses on the American side were real but comparatively light, thanks to the Wildcats' resilience. Reports note multiple instances of Wildcats returning with their wings torn open or engines coughing black smoke, yet still managing to land on tiny carrier decks. To Luftwaffe analysts, this survivability was baffling. One German report admitted with frustration, "The American fighter continues to operate under damage that would cripple our machines. This alters the balance of encounters." Carrier commanders also noticed the Wildcat's effect on convoy morale. Sailors, long terrorized by Condor patrols, began to cheer when Wildcats scrambled. To men staring at the endless horizon, the little fighter became a symbol of defiance. One British escort captain remarked, "It is not the prettiest machine, but when the barrel climbs into the sky, we all breathe easier." The shift in perception was profound. What had been dismissed as an obsolete stopgap was now hailed as the guardian of the sea lanes. For the Germans, the frustration deepened into a kind of reluctant respect mixed with fear. Luftwaffe aces privately admitted that facing Wildcats was no longer a trivial task. Their endurance and teamwork made them costly opponents. Intelligence sharing between Berlin and Tokyo carried increasingly grim notes. The same aircraft once mocked in Europe was now bleeding Japan's elite pilots dry in the Pacific while tearing apart German bombers over the Atlantic. The transformation in pilot psychology can be traced in diaries and memoirs. Early war entries mock the American barrel. By late 1943, the tone darkens. We attack, and they do not fall. They keep coming. Another pilot wrote bitterly after losing comrades to convoy escorts, "It is unfair. Our machines are faster, sleeker. Yet theirs survives, and we perish." These were not just complaints, they were admissions of a paradigm shift. The Luftwaffe's confidence, once unshakable, was eroding under the Wildcat's claws. By mid-1943, the Wildcat had achieved what mockery said it never could. It dominated its chosen battlefield. Not by elegance, not by speed, but by stubborn resilience and unrelenting firepower. Every Condor shot down, every Heinkel forced into the waves, every Ju-88 blasted from the sky reinforced the same lesson: underestimation is a fatal mistake. And the Germans, who had once laughed the loudest, were now among those who feared it most. By late 1943, the Wildcat was no longer the newest fighter in the American arsenal. The powerful F4F Hellcat and the bent-winged F4U Corsair were beginning to dominate the skies of the Pacific, bringing speeds and firepower the stubby F4F could never match. Yet the Wildcat refused to fade quietly. While its sleeker cousins took center stage on fleet carriers, the Wildcat found a second life aboard the smaller escort carriers that continued to prowl the Atlantic and Pacific. There, its ruggedness and compact design made it indispensable. In convoy protection duty, the Wildcat still reigned supreme. German Condor crews, once so confident, now treated every approach to a convoy as a gamble with death. The Luftwaffe tried sending Ju-88s in tighter formations, hoping massed firepower would fend off the American fighters. But Wildcats thrived in these brawls. Their Browning .50s shredded formation after formation, breaking the cohesion of German attacks. One after-action report from 1944 describes a squadron of Wildcats intercepting 8 Ju-88s, downing 4 and scattering the rest. Not a single bomber reached its target. The numbers told a grim story for Germany. Between 1943 and early 1944, Wildcats from escort carriers destroyed more than 200 German aircraft over the Atlantic, while suffering relatively minor losses. In many cases, even when Wildcats were badly damaged, they still made it back to their ships. Pilots recorded hair-raising landings with landing gear half shot away, wings barely holding, engines coughing their last breaths, yet still alive. For the Luftwaffe, accustomed to quick, clean victories, this resilience was maddening. Psychology by now had shifted completely. Where once German pilots mocked the Wildcat as a barrel, they now wrote of it with grudging awe. A diary entry from a Luftwaffe reconnaissance officer captured this change. "We used to call it the American toy. Now we know it as the American hammer. It pounds and pounds, and when you think it is finished, it rises again. The contempt of 1940 had turned into resignation by 1944. The Pacific, too, continued to echo with the Wildcat's defiance. Even as Hellcats and Corsairs claimed the glory at battles like the Philippine Sea, Wildcats flown from escort carriers guarded amphibious landings, strafed Japanese positions, and intercepted kamikazes. Though slower, they remained effective killers. At Leyte Gulf, Wildcats destroyed dozens of incoming attackers, their guns still carving arcs of fire across the sky. For Marines landing on the beaches, the sound of those guns was reassurance that their guardian angels still circled above. For the Germans, watching from afar, these reports deepened a sense of futility. If even America's obsolete fighters could dominate their battlefields, what chance did the Reich have once the newer designs, Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs, arrived in force? Luftwaffe intelligence officers began to frame the Wildcat not as a rival to the 109 or FW-190, but as proof of American industrial philosophy: build machines that survive, swarm the skies with numbers, and wear down even the most skilled opponents. That philosophy terrified them. German doctrine had long favored the duel, the swift strike of the ace, the elegance of maneuver. But by 1944, aces found themselves facing swarms of durable aircraft that simply would not fall. The Wildcat embodied that nightmare. What had been dismissed as crude and outdated had become a symbol of attrition warfare, the kind of war Germany could not win. As the Wildcat's combat career wound down, its reputation in enemy minds had reached its zenith. No longer a laughingstock, it was now remembered with a shiver of respect. Luftwaffe pilots described it as a stone in the shoe, never glamorous, always uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. And among those who had fought it directly, the verdict was harsher still. "You could kill one," wrote a German bomber pilot in 1944, "but it would cost you too much." And there was always another waiting. Thus, the arc of the Wildcat's transformation closed. From mockery to menace, from barrel to hammer, it had forced even its most arrogant enemies to acknowledge its worth. Though replaced on the front lines, it left behind a legacy etched in steel and smoke, a fighter underestimated, then feared, and finally respected. For the Luftwaffe, that legacy was bitter. Their laughter had turned into silence, their arrogance into resignation. And for the men who flew the Wildcat, battered and scarred, it was vindication. The machine that should not have mattered had changed the course of battles, and in doing so, reshaped the psychology of the war in the air. The Wildcat story did not end with its last combat sortie. Its true impact can only be understood in the ripples it left across strategy, technology, and psychology. Though eventually overshadowed by its successors, the F6F Hellcat and the F4U Corsair, the Wildcat carved an enduring legacy as the machine that forced both friend and foe to rethink what mattered most in aerial warfare. The most immediate consequence was psychological. For the Luftwaffe, the Wildcat shattered the illusion of invincibility. German pilots had entered the war believing themselves heirs to a tradition of knights of the air, wielding sleek machines of elegance and precision. The Wildcat mocked that narrative, not with words, but with scars and survival. Again and again, Luftwaffe reports describe the frustration of seeing Wildcats absorb fire that should have killed them, only to return to battle. That frustration corroded confidence. Aces who had built reputations on clean kills now faced opponents who refused to die. And when confidence falters in aerial combat, so does performance. For the Americans, the Wildcat became a teacher. Its limitations forced pilots to innovate tactics rather than rely on brute speed or agility. The thatch weave, devised specifically to compensate for the Wildcat's slowness, became a cornerstone of U.S. Navy doctrine. Even when newer fighters arrived, the lesson endured: teamwork and coordination matter more than individual brilliance. This marked a profound shift away from the cult of the lone ace, a shift that aligned with America's broader philosophy of war: industrial strength, collective effort, and attrition over spectacle. Technologically, the Wildcat's rugged design philosophy left fingerprints on future aircraft. The Hellcat, designed as its successor, carried forward the same emphasis on survivability but paired it with speed and firepower to overwhelm the Zero. The Corsair, with its bent wings and monstrous engine, likewise embodied the belief that endurance could coexist with power. Both aircraft inherited the Wildcat's insistence on pilot protection, self-sealing tanks, and rugged construction. In that sense, the Wildcat was the prototype for a new generation of American fighters that would sweep the skies clear by 1944. Its influence extended beyond hardware. The Navy's carrier doctrine, tested under fire with Wildcats, evolved into the blueprint for modern naval aviation. Before the Wildcat, few believed fighters could truly dominate the open ocean. But by holding the line in battles like Midway and Guadalcanal, Wildcats proved that carrier-based aviation could decide wars. That revelation reshaped global strategy. After 1945, every major power recognized that control of the seas required not battleships but carriers, and carriers required fighters tough enough to live, fight, and return. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, paid a heavy price for underestimating such machines. Their failure to grasp the importance of survivability and attrition left them ill-prepared for the grinding war of production that followed. Even the introduction of advanced aircraft like the FW-190 or the Me-262 could not reverse the tide, because the Allies had already learned from the Wildcat that wars are not won by brilliance alone. They are won by machines that keep flying, by pilots who keep returning, by strategies that emphasize endurance. One of the Wildcat's most enduring consequences was cultural. Among American pilots, it became a symbol of grit, the ugly little fighter that carried them through impossible odds. Many veterans spoke of the Wildcat with affection, even after flying sleeker aircraft. They remembered it not for glamour but for loyalty. One pilot wrote years later, "The Wildcat was like a bulldog. Small, stubborn, not graceful, but you trusted it. It never left you when you needed it." That trust mattered, because trust between man and machine is what sustains morale in the chaos of war. Even the enemy, in retrospect, acknowledged its impact. Post-war memoirs by German officers often mention the shock of facing American fighters that seemed to ignore damage. One Luftwaffe ace, interviewed decades later, admitted, "We were wrong to laugh. Their philosophy was sound. They built machines for war, not for show. We built machines for duels. They built them for campaigns. That difference decided the war." In that confession lies the Wildcat's ultimate vindication. Statistically, its record was impressive for an aircraft so maligned. Wildcats accounted for thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed across the Pacific and Atlantic, often achieving favorable kill ratios despite inferior performance metrics. They held the line until 1943, when Hellcats and Corsairs could take over. Without that holding action, the U.S. Navy might have lost its carriers, its footholds, and perhaps the war at sea. The Wildcat did not win the war alone, but without it, the Allies might never have had the chance to win at all. Its long-term influence can be traced even further. The concept of survivability that defined the Wildcat reappears in modern designs. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, decades later, embodied the same philosophy. Slow, ugly, mocked by many, but nearly indestructible and beloved by those who flew it. The lesson the Wildcat taught remains relevant. In combat, the ability to take punishment and return may outweigh the ability to dazzle in performance. In the final reckoning, the Wildcat's legacy was transformation, of perception, of doctrine, of strategy. It forced the Luftwaffe to confront its own arrogance. It forced American pilots to grow smarter, braver, more coordinated. It forced naval planners to embrace carriers as the future of warfare. And above all, it forced everyone who underestimated it to learn a bitter lesson. Contempt is easy, survival is hard. From laughter to fear, from mockery to legend, the F4F Wildcat left behind more than wreckage. It left behind a philosophy etched into aviation history. Never judge a warplane by its elegance. Judge it by whether it brings its pilot home. And by that standard, the Wildcat was one of the greatest of its time. History often reserves its loudest applause for machines that dazzle, the sleek interceptor, the record-breaking bomber, the ace-maker. The F4F Wildcat was none of those things. It was squat, stubborn, underpowered, and mocked by friend and foe alike. And yet, when the world tilted on the edge of catastrophe, it was this little fighter that clawed the Allies back from the abyss. The Wildcat story is not about brilliance. It is about survival. Against the Zero, it refused to play the enemy's game, inventing tactics that outlived the war. Against the Messerschmitt and German bombers, it endured punishment that should have killed it and returned to fight another day. On convoy decks, on coral airstrips, in the chaos of Midway and the mud of Guadalcanal, it was always there, scarred, battered, smoking, but still alive. The Luftwaffe's greatest mistake was not in building inferior aircraft but in dismissing the Wildcat as irrelevant. Their arrogance blinded them to its true strength. They believed speed and elegance were decisive. The Wildcat taught the opposite. Resilience and attrition win wars. For every pilot who limped home in a damaged Wildcat, the Allies preserved not just a man but experience, morale, and momentum. Germany could not match that equation. The lesson endures. In warfare, contempt is a liability. Underestimation is a weapon handed to the enemy. The Wildcat's ugly frame reminds us that survival often outweighs style, and that endurance is as deadly a weapon as speed. Its legacy is written not in sleek lines but in scars, the kind that prove it lived through fire and still came back. As we look back, the laughter of German pilots has long since faded into silence. What remains is respect, hard-earned and reluctant. The flying barrel became the survivor, the hammer, the shield of the fleet. Its roar was not beautiful, but it was unforgettable. And now, as we close this chapter of aviation history, I want to invite you to carry that lesson with you. If stories like this, where machines reveal the arrogance and resilience of nations, speak to you, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss the next journey into the shadows and triumphs of history's forgotten machines. Hit the bell icon, because the past is not silent, it still echoes, if we choose to listen. The F4F Wildcat may have been mocked when it rose into the sky. But by the time the war was done, its enemies no longer laughed. They looked up, saw its stubby wings, heard the thunder of its Brownings, and felt only dread. That is the mark of a legend.